Let's bring in investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge. She is following the story from Washington. So, Catherine, take us through the latest developments. I mean, people were obviously watching that press conference, but you've got some reporting on who these men are exactly, what they're being charged with. And we know that they're accused of belonging to an ISIS cell that's responsible for executing American aid workers, journalists, and other hostages in Syria.
That's right. So good morning. Let me walk you through it. This stands to be probably one of the most significant terrorism trials in this country of the last decade, with the extradition of these two British nationals who stand accused of a conspiracy to take hostages and ultimately murder four Americans. James Foley and Stephen Sotloff both were acting as journalists in Syria, as well as Peter Kassig and Kayla Mueller, who were there on a humanitarian basis. What has been unsealed by the court in the Eastern District of Virginia is a 24-page indictment, and there are 8 criminal counts. I think to understand the gravity of these counts, I'd just like to take a minute and read through them. The first count is conspiracy to commit hostage-taking that ends in death. 2 through 5 are hostage-taking that does end in death. Count 6 is a conspiracy to murder U.S. citizens outside of the United States. And the final 2 counts, 7 and 8, are providing material support to a terrorist organization, in this case, ISIS. In the Q&A portion, Anne-Marie and Vlad, we got a sense of the details that are being brought in this case with the cooperation of the British government. The head of the National Security Division said they want to bring the fullest case possible, the strongest case possible, based on the most fulsome evidence. And to do that, they've had the cooperation of the British to provide evidence as well as intelligence. And it seems to be that the deal is that in exchange for that help, the U.S. government will not seek the death penalty in this case. Reporters were told that the 2 British nationals were part of a conspiracy to take hostages that resulted in the death of these hostages. Also, they facilitated ransom payments, and prior to the death of these hostages, they were behind extreme torture and abuse of these individuals. So this brings to a new chapter the prosecution of 2 men, British nationals, who are accused of facilitating the death, the beheading in 3 of the cases of Americans who were in Syria, either reporting or acting to support humanitarian aid at that time.
So, Catherine, I'm reading, and you can clarify if I'm getting anything wrong, that these 2 men have been in American military custody basically since last year, but getting them to trial here in the U.S. has been a long process. Why did it take so long?
Well, it's taken a long time because of these extraterritorial issues and custody issues and the issue of the death penalty, Anne-Marie. As we heard at the news conference, if the Justice Department is going to bring a case like this inside the United States to bring justice for the American families who lost their sons and daughters in Syria, they wanted to bring a case that they could have full confidence that they could win at trial. And to do that, they wanted evidence and cooperation of the British authorities. Remember, these 2 men are British nationals, so they wanted to get them into U.S. custody, brought to the United States, and then also have the cooperation of the government in London that they could get the evidence they need to secure a conviction. But the British do not support the death penalty in any cases. And there was a push, given the extreme nature of the alleged offenses, to seek the death penalty in this case. I think folks at home will understand if they think back to 2014, 2015, 2016, and the videotaped execution of these Americans. Think of James Foley kneeling in that orange jumpsuit, and Peter Kassig in those final moments before they were beheaded. But the deal was done to get the evidence from the British to try and build the strongest case, but in exchange, not to seek the death penalty, and then to also try these British citizens in an American court, because these crimes relate to the death of American citizens.
Yeah, we all recall those horrific videos that were released, and of course, what made it even all the more intriguing and sort of spoke to the rise of ISIS and was the fact that these men on the videos had these these English accents, these British accents. And so, you know, many years later now, our Justice Department is finally hoping to bring these individuals to justice. And what do you know, Catherine, about, I mean, there's a lot of reporting out there on, for example, how they were able to gather the information about their victims and how they were able to gather Kayla's email address, for example. What are you learning about those conditions of those two men?
Well, I've been reporting on this subject really since the hostages were taken, starting around, if my memory serves me correctly, 2014. And one detail I would share with both of you is that I learned that about a year into the captivity of these American citizens, they were held in the ISIS stronghold of Raqqa, and in what amounted to almost a sort of apartment or condo complex. And the hostages were separated by genders, so the women in one area and the men in the other, and there was like a common room or a bathing facility that connected them. They did not have any in-person contact with each other, but what I learned through my reporting is they left messages for each other in sort of the crooks of the tiles in the bathroom, reassuring each other that they were okay and not being mistreated. What we know now, I get chills even thinking about it now, what we know now, especially in the case of Kayla Mueller, that she was in fact horribly mistreated by the leader of ISIS, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, and systematically raped and assaulted almost on a nightly basis. I don't want to give away a lot of confidences, but I've had the opportunity to talk to a very senior military official who was directly involved in efforts to secure those hostages, and he described to me Kayla Mueller's treatment as that she was slowly dying night after night because of the level of abuse by the ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So really what I learned through my reporting was the strength of these hostages to try and have a bond with each other and reassure each other, even in captivity at a time where the treatment really was beyond horrific.
Oh, man, that is incredible. And so now we are looking at probably, I mean, this is going to be a major trial, huge case. So where do we go from here moving forward? What are the next steps? When will we next see or hear from these men or their attorneys, I suppose? Well, in a case of this nature, I don't want to speculate because I think it's just bad form and something this significant, and for journalism in general. But what I would say is it would follow a standard path that you would see in virtually any criminal case, because they will be treated like any criminal suspect inside our justice system. What we anticipate is that they'll have what amounts to an initial appearance at the courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia. And if you think back over the last 2 decades, that has been the courthouse where almost all of these major national security terrorism cases have been brought, whether it was one of the 9/11 suspects, Zacharias Moussaoui, to John Walker Lind, who they called Taliban John. I mean, this has been the venue for most of these prosecutions. So there would be an initial appearance, there would be a reading of the charges, they would be provided with defense attorneys. But you make a very good point, Anne-Marie. This is really the beginning of a very long journey still to a trial and ultimately a prosecution and guilty finding by a jury of American citizens, but they will be afforded the same rights as any defendant. And the Justice Department officials were very careful to say that these were allegations contained within the indictment, and they were careful not to go beyond what they kept calling the 4 corners of that 24-page returned indictment from the grand jury. It's an important distinction, Catherine, just because I was going to say, Anne-Marie, it's an important distinction because these men did not afford Peter Kasich, Stephen Sotloff, Kayla Mueller, and James Foley those very same. And I'm sure that their families, who will never be able to replace their loved ones, will find some small comfort in that these men are now facing trial for their heinous crimes. I do note you mentioned Jihadi John, Catherine, and there was also a fourth, Ain Leslie Davis. Jihadi John was killed, I think, in an attack, in a drone strike back in 2015. Drone attack.
Right.
But
the other guy went to prison in Turkey. So there were supposedly 4 of them.
That's right, the 4 Beatles. Remember, they were called the 4 Beatles, that nickname because of their British accent. But that's where the comparison stops, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, Vlad and Catherine, when you brought up sort of hearing the British accent, I think it was so incredibly jarring for us, for many people. I think, you know, Catherine, this is kind of your area of expertise, but I think for the world, when we saw those videos, they were slick and this high quality production and this British accent. I think it sort of shifted things for many people about who really ISIS was. Who are these people who are hidden behind, you know, these outfits and covering their faces? It was really eye-opening.
And the global reach, right? It wasn't. I think the notion was that these were people who were generally born in those countries who were carrying these out. But what we realized is that ISIS had exported this brand of terrorism to the West, and that is when it feels to me that our law enforcement officials and the military and the President of the United States himself began to sort of think about this in a different manner than we had thought about it before.
Well, it's the issue of foreign fighters, right? We used to almost consistently in the news cycle talk about foreign fighters. These are foreign nationals who are traveling to Syria to join ISIS or the al-Qaeda affiliate there, al-Nusra. But I think your point is well taken. What made these videos so, for lack of a better term, impactful is that they were so westernized in terms of their production, and then also the British accent. And it showed the depth and the breadth and the reach of the ISIS ideology. And of course, it really brought it home here in the United States to see American citizens who, in the case of Peter Kassig and James Foley, were going to Syria at considerable risk to tell the story of the civil war in that country and the existence of these terrorist organizations. So to give a voice to the voiceless, and then they lost their own lives in such a violent and public way, and then the humanitarian workers as well. So Peter Kassig and Kayla Mueller, who were there to help and ultimately lost their lives as well. But it was this almost westernization of this ideology in a video type format that was so distressing and was able to spread so quickly, because one of the key components of this radicalization is what I've always called the digital jihad. They're able to use the technology to further this very hateful ideology, and in this case to instill such fear thousands of miles away from this battlefront in Syria.
Yeah, so true. Catherine, thank you so much.
Thank you.